Welcome to Rally Bytes Radio on the 15th of January 2015. Delighted to have our regular guest Alan Watt on the line. You there, Alan?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, you've mentioned many times about how populations are stampeded. Now, everybody imagines a stampede. They've seen the wildlife movies where the wildebeest being chased by the lions, or seen riots or something where people are crushed or whatever. But the stampede you're talking about is more a mental stampede, from what I understand. And this kind of technique, if you like, has been used for a long, long time. And do you have any kind of insight into where this kind of technique stems from? What's the psychology behind it?
It's ancient, actually. If you go back into ancient times when people lived in tribes, they had it's a natural thing in tribes to have a leader or an elected leader. And the tribesman, the chieftain generally has no more than the rest of the people, is given respect, and after he's done his year, 2 years, whatever, someone else takes over with the consent of the whole tribe. That's how it used to be pretty well across the world. But with the rise of commerce, the early commerce, there were, again, the psychopathic types, you might say, who could see how they could aggrandize themselves and benefit themselves if they only had rulership over the people, and become hereditary, basically. This is a shortcut to it. If they could have their offspring take over, etc., etc. And you find the earliest signs of this, again, across the Middle East and Asia, where commerce came in with eventually, and out of wherever, who knows, they decided on a standard of money. Money's the key to all of this. Money takes you off of a natural system of, say, a collective survival and hunter-gatherers, or even early agriculture and barter. It takes you from that to the middleman. The middleman then has the power, and the middleman will always accumulate wealth. So if the middleman can also eventually manage this introduction of something to exchange, which is called money, where it's weighed or whatever, or minted, and have the people accept it, then he can eventually take over and decide the value of that currency. That's been ongoing for thousands of years. And across that particular area, that's where they understood this in early times. From then on through the Phoenicians, which also was related to the groups in the Middle East, they traveled the world, again, through trade, and they tried to introduce their coinage everywhere too. Initially, they would do straight barter, with folk who'd meet in different shores and islands, and eventually they'd say, no, we don't want, we want you to give us this stuff. You start using this stuff, but to get this coin, you'll have to give us X amount of fur or grain or whatever it happens to be. And that's what they did. That's what the ancient, a lot of the ancient wars were about. Was when they took over a country eventually, and got a hierarchy in that country, like a king established. Instead of a chief, you create a hereditary king with a family. Then he's out for his own self-benefit, and his family's too. To live better than the rest of the people, you must live off of the people. I don't care how else it's done. That's as simple as that. And so they worked with the middlemen, the money managers, and so on. They had to work always down through time together and create these long family lineages and so on. But in the early times, so the Phoenicians, you had the 100-Year Wars with even the Spartans, etc., as they took over island after island and used the countries that were indebted to these money men, come merchants. They'd use that money and the debt that was owed them to force the kings they'd helped to establish to use their people, their armies, to conquer the next country that would then force the money system upon them. And that took well over 100 years, you know. And once they got the coinage in there, like coinage of silver, about 800 BC, then they realized that they'd have to force that currency across the world, which they did in ancient times. They found these coins, by the way, across the world, even on the east coast of early America. So this world's been well-traveled many, many thousands of years ago, long before Columbus. But anyway, the idea was, how do you rule all these people? Once you get them into an artificial system, it's easier to rule them because they'll then believe that they will lose their ability to even have self-preservation and survival. An artificial money system, or any money system, brings a new system of living in an artificial system. If you create a city, for instance, and all the kings wanted cities, then everything in that city is an artificial system. They're not hunting, they're not gathering, they need money to bring in all their foodstuffs. They've got to get an army, so they need money to pay the army, etc., etc., and so on. So this whole thing is a perpetual self-motion machine. It keeps going and going and going once you got to establish. Even Plato talked about how cities eventually would dominate the world, these city-states. And they could change the culture within those city walls all the time because they still have workers inside the city working now for money in artificial systems, as we are today, all sitting in offices and things, and people are working on computers and they hate their jobs, but it's completely artificial. It's unnatural for the human being to do. But we're taught down through centuries that this is all quite normal, and we accept it. Now, those with the money system and those who understand how it works use that as a big clout on the general public to keep them in line. Because the more you abuse a person or a whole population, you keep them fearful, and you've taught and trained them that this is all quite normal, this system. Then when something is threatened, a financial crash or devaluation of your currency or poverty, then the people and the various groups that represent the people stand up and say, do something to the very guys who are abusing you. And this is the system they've used all along, is fear, fear, fear. So the more they abuse you, the more the people are trained that you really need them and they're experts. And the experts, which are well aware, how come things never get any better? The bankers always plunder us. This combination of bankers plunder the public at least twice a century, every century, at least twice, sometimes 3 times a century. We bail them out. There's nothing new in this at all. This has been going on for a long, long, long time. And because they also run what's called the establishment, the whole system of normality at the top, the law system, everything, then nothing is ever done to really change because they want to do it again and again and again. But with the money system and with this commerce thing, you have powerful elite groups and the money system all combined together, completely interwoven. They also use those armies to go and plunder other countries under thousands of guises. And if you've got like the New American Century project that we knew about in the 90s, where they had all the countries wanted scheduled for the U.S. wanted scheduled to be taken out, starting with Afghanistan. They published it on their own website with Paul Wolfowitz and all the rest of them. Afghanistan, then Iraq, then they wanted Syria, and Israel too wanted the U.S. Army to go straight from Iraq into Syria and take Syria out at the same time, then Libya and then Iran. And they've accomplished almost all of those goals, and they're still on their way to accomplishing the last parts of it. Published years before 2001.
I think Venezuela and North Korea were on that as well.
Long ago, North Korea was too. Mm-hmm. But you understand too that you're trained to think of yourself as a nation. Every country is, and you're taught to be proud of your nation, etc., etc. That's the first lie you're taught, because the bankers who might live in your country, some of them, also tell the top politicians, in fact, they make sure they get them in, that their boys get in, and they have their plans, this ongoing world domination thing, of taking over the whole world and getting it on one currency system down the road. And in the process, they also want to incredibly enrich themselves. It's never, they can't satiate their hunger for power, these people. They don't say, well, I've earned $15 trillion this year worldwide, so I've got enough. It doesn't work that way. Power is an aberration. The strength of power is an aberration. But unfortunately, in this system, it's the normal aberration. So much so that those down below, all the working slobs, are taught to try and emulate it too. So they give you that kind of culture, a psychopathic type spillover culture that trickles down and becomes your culture, with the nonsense that anyone can make it, etc. But when you look at other countries, like I say, and drop their plans for war for the future, and they mean it. They don't draw them up at these big think tanks just to toss ideas around. Then they've got to get a valid excuse, seemingly to the public, to go and invade those countries. But they don't call it invasion. They always call it going to liberate them or spreading democracy. The ancient Romans said the same thing. They were going spreading culture everywhere. They're civilizing people. And, of course, we saw that after 9/11, Afghanistan and Iraq and so on, that they used the same terms. They were bringing them democracy into nations where this was a foreign concept. And we forget ourselves that 100-odd years ago, democracy, say, in Europe and Britain, was also a foreign concept. You didn't have what you think of democracy today back then. They may have called it a democratic government, but it simply meant, in fact, 100 years ago in Britain, you had to own land to go and vote, and so many houses, etc. Tenants, you couldn't vote up until the World War I, inside World War I. That's where they gave them the vote, by the way, the folk who were landless. So democracy's understanding keeps changing as they push the con and keep pushing the con. Even Winston Churchill wrote in the early 1900s this strange concept of democracy that certain elements coming into Britain were trying to push. And at that time they had different covers. One of the covers was Marxism. So what you've got is the pretense of democracy. You've got this terrible indoctrination of the population, more so I think in the U.S., of a classless society, which is an absolute laughing joke, It's completely laughable. But if you train the public like that, you can always get them to join up in hordes and go off and fight for any excuse you give them. And when you often fight, what you do is accomplish your missions, which is you take over the lands, just like Britain did with its empire. The public pay for the armies to go off, the shipping off of armies and all the munitions, everything else that goes with it, and logistics. And you put down railroad lines, you put in airstrips today, things like that. We pay for it all, and then private contracts are given to the boys that want to get the mining out, the diamonds, the gold, the oil, all these kinds of things. It's private enterprise that rules it all, and we pay for it all under the guise of democracy, spreading freedom and spreading democracy and all that nonsense. You have to retrain your mind to actually believe what it's actually seeing, instead of being told what to perceive and what you're seeing.
Yeah. I was going to. You mentioned fear earlier on, and we did a program on that a while ago. But war certainly is the big tool to stampede people in many different ways. And the most obvious, I suppose, is refugees. And that again brings its own problems for neighbouring countries, or not necessarily neighbouring countries, but in the form of mass immigration to countries which again are alien to their own culture.
Yes, it's called geopolitics again. That's what they call it at the top. Where we tend to be short-term thinkers. Most folk are short-term thinkers. Women are more long-term thinkers than men. Men can understand small projects that want to get done immediately and they'll go to it and get it done. Women can actually plan ahead, even years in advance. But at the top, since we've been so well studied, they've used a combination of both techniques at the top. Through the intelligence services, the big agencies that run all the other agencies, etc., etc. The RAND Corporation, many corporations involved, big think tanks, on constantly studying humanity. And now with internet, they can keep the pulse on the public and see what's working, what's not working, propaganda technique. So what you've got is the ability to say, okay, we'll start off here like a chessboard. Here's where we want to go. But in the meantime, we'll make these moves, these moves, these moves, and these moves, and these moves. And eventually we'll get to our goal at the end. It's an ongoing game. I call it the never-ending story because it's meant to go on and on and on, like George Orwell said in 1984. So we see the immediate, all the propaganda is always for immediacy. You've got to attack Iraq. Now, even in Canada, they were doing studies in Canada and different psychological associations, universities, and they noticed how the media that started off bashing Afghanistan initially for 9/11 and Ben Laden and so on, quietly over the course of a year, once they were in Afghanistan, started to focus and tried to, almost in a subliminal way until it was overt, get the public used to the idea that Saddam Hussein was involved in it. And even though during that period when inquiry came up and Bush Jr. said, well, Iraq had nothing to do with it. He says Saddam's just a bad man. He's better out of the way. That was good enough. But the fact is, the American public had been trained. Saddam was the ultimate bad guy for a while. So you had this schizophrenic attitude. No, it was bin Laden. That got the war started. And then they shifted the gun sites to Iraq and blamed Saddam Hussein. So that's all it took in the media, constant subliminals and then into overt blaming until the public in America accepted having to invade Iraq, you see. These are that's how you do geopolitics. And then, of course, after the end of Iraq, when we were through there, Israel came out in the newspapers and television and said, well, and they told the U.S., go straight now into Syria. All their enemies, they want to be taken out too, you see. And why do it yourself when somebody else is going to do it for you and pay for it all too? So it almost came to that. Instead, it didn't work, and you had to spend a few years and then work up this Al-Qaeda nonsense that was all funded by the West to invade Syria, which is still ongoing today. And now they keep changing the names to confuse the public who catch on to what's going on. It's the same group, totally funded by the West, and that's how you do geopolitics. And then eventually they'll only have, if you get Syria out of the way, they've only got Iran to do, and then they have all the oil fields, all the minerals, all the aquifers, the water, and so on. It's just incredible the wealth they're given to private companies who didn't put a penny forward and to get this war going. They get all the rewards, but that's how the British Empire was actually built. It's never changed. And we tend to think, again, stop thinking in countries like, oh, the Rothschilds live in London. No, the Rothschilds lived in the U.S. and London and other places, two different branches of the family. And they'll use whatever country is handy at the time to get their geopolitical strategy through, including funding the United Nations, funding the World Bank and all the rest of it through the CFR and the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which they set up and owned. They were the guys who financed Alfred Milner and guys like that. They set up the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the private organization that literally drafted up the United Nations treaty and everything else. They drafted up the European Union amalgamation. They drafted up the North American NAFTA agreement too. They came on television. Their branch here in Canada, the CFR, admitted on television and on an hour-long show, news show, to BBC, that they drafted it up and gave it to them all to sign, the three amigos to sign into law, Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. A private organization that most folk haven't heard of. You can't just join it because you have to be asked to go and join the thing. And after you've been well vetted, I mean, they've studied you for years if they bring you in. And the public have no votes in anything that's going on here, including the CFR. Why are private organizations running the whole world's commerce, money, and everything else today, while we go through this farce that we're democratic? I can't even use the word democracy anymore. It's a complete. It's not even a dead joke now. It's disintegrated way under the earth.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the CFR and people being stampeded, and I just think of Jerry Adams was invited to talk there, so I mean he's part of that group as well, and of course he's touted as this great Republican leader, and now he's in mainstream politics and everything. I wonder who he was working for. You know, how many people he's stampeded?
I always knew that with him.
Yeah, and McGuinness. Okay, I mean the effects on the general public, obviously through the media, through the news, the television. Sorry, think of it like 9/11, all these disasters, 7/7, tsunamis, where it's on the TV like constantly. In particular, what's happening now with this Paris thing, how that's been blown out of all proportion in terms of the small event that it was. I'm not simplifying the fact that people were killed or anything, but it's a fairly minor tragedy, if I can put it that way, compared to some of the horrors that Israel's inflicted in Palestine, for example, or the one a few weeks ago where the Afghan army mislaid a rocket and fired it into a wedding party and killed 40 people. We don't hear world leaders on the street about that, But this thing is it's playing on the public psyche and basically stampeding them down the road to a more police state and to accept a harsher police state.
Well, there's no doubt about it. To introduce anything which takes away freedoms and rights from the people, again, it's ancient. You must terrify the people that you're all going to get killed or massacred in your beds by these nasty people. And so if they don't create the incident themselves, which is a very common thing in through history, if they don't create it themselves, then they'll certainly aid and abet it happening to some little group. They'll finance them. They'll help them get to their target in order to use the event to. You see, there's a lot of strategies to do with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and it was fantastic to see how the psychology worked in the Soviet intelligence and MI5 and 6, because they were both the same. And the idea on the Marxian side or Soviet side was going to countries that are third world or they're sinking first world countries, where there's lots of unemployment, agitate the people, but don't help the people. Attack all charities, because charities give aid out to the people which alleviate their misery. We don't want their misery alleviated, make it worse. And then they'll get really angry. The whole point was to get people really angry and uprise and overthrow. And then the group that was behind it all would jump in, just like the Bolsheviks jumped over all the socialist groups and became the leaders of Russia, you see. They used them all to get the leadership as a strategy. And what the Soviets also said was, if we can get them agitated until the West, the so-called fascist countries, responded in an overt, heavy-handed manner by taking away all the rights to the people, we can then point and say, see, we told you so, that's what's really running your country, these monsters and power-mad, crazy people, and then you'd revolt again. So this was the psychology of using the masses of people to do your bidding for you, even down to making their misery worse to make sure they'd revolt. In the West, it was different. The West got into psychological warfare and cultural warfare, very important. Both countries did it. And under the cultural system, they hired people who were running the entertainment business in the U.S. primarily, some in Britain too, which is an in-group clique, you might say. And they made them ambassadors for culture for the West and across the European countries, and even going into the Soviet Union with certain shows and so on. And what their idea was this is what they told people in their intelligence reports, the idea, the CIA ran it from the U.S., and it was called American Cultural Cold War, and the idea was to show how liberated so-called democracy in the West was when it came to ideas and freedoms. So they pushed nudity, they pushed all these things. So you see, we don't have these barriers that you have there. You're inhibited in Soviet system, etc. And the idea was to make the ones in the West and in the Soviet system, the youth especially, try and emulate things like the pop music, then the rock music, etc. And then the miniskirts and so on. And so the Soviet Union actually adopted that technique. The early music television series, they put their own version on in the Soviet Union, not as raunchy, but getting there, you might say, because then they have to keep their people happy. Massive cultural wars go on like that as outside forces change your culture internally. So there's a lot more involved in intelligence work and long-term strategy and geopolitics than just the immediate thing that you see in the paper today. When you get back to the immigration policies you're talking about for refugees, they were well aware that they would bring problems into their country, the home country. Britain, for instance, in the 70s, they opened the floodgate under an agreement, by the way, from the 1930s in the Royal Institute of International Affairs. That's all the British Commonwealth countries. But eventually, they would bring in they'd open the borders up for people from India, especially. That was one of their biggest prizes, was India. And they would bring straight immigration right into Britain. And in the 70s, they brought them in en masse, just flooding in. And that was to deculturalize the people at home. That was part of the reason. But down the road, they knew in the 70s, because I knew in the strategies, if they ever end up attacking those countries in the future, their homelands abroad, to grab whatever wealth there is that they want, I said there's going to be riots here, because you've got ready-made people who are different. They're different from, say, Northern Hemisphere people. It's a completely different ethnology involved in it in anthropology. They're in groups, big families, all connected, and so on. That's a different system than the northern folk and how they developed. And they will keep their culture for generations that they brought over from their homelands, opposed to the one they adapt. Or they might like to adapt into yours. You know, a kind of pretense to an extent. But down the road, if they've ever attacked, say, Muslim countries, then they could be guaranteed to have a population at home of Muslims that would then riot at home. Then you can push forth laws that would affect everyone, say in Britain, even people who have their genes go back for thousands of years in that area.
So, I mean,
we saw the same thing in the US as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was. We talk about movies and predictive programming, but I think it was Children of Men, where they showed you just that scenario. And they based it on Muslims. And at the end of the movie, all you've got are these hordes of Muslims walking through the streets with Kalashnikovs shouting "Allah Akbar" in the centre of London. Mm-hmm. And then they showed you the train station where they've got the cages with all the immigrants in it, and the dogs and the heavy-handed police officers. And that movie was made, I don't know now, 10, 15 years ago now, something, or 10 years ago at least. And here we are. We're not far off it. And another couple of incidents. I mean, I can imagine what would have happened in London if the Charlie Hebdo thing had happened there. I would imagine they would have shut London down completely. I think they're well ready for it.
Here's the thing, though. Back in the early 80s, there was an attempt. Something happened in London, in England. There was a few terrorists took over. I think it was the British Petroleum Tower building in London. And that eventually got publicised widely when you brought the SAS. Nobody had seen the SAS operating in their own country before. And they were sailing down the lines, all dressed in black, and they smashed through windows and so on to rescue the hostages. And at the time, they said it was Iranian terrorists that were involved. And even the SS admitted they were supposed to kill every terrorist in there. They didn't want anyone to stay alive to say why they had come or who sent them or anything else,
Well, the same things happened in Paris. They wiped out those guys as well.
The thing was too, though, after that, that the Iranian embassy had to move back to Iran. We're forgetting too. This was all in that era where Britain had been heavily involved in running Iran and getting it all out for years and years and years. And they put the Shah in and all the rest of it. And the Iranians were not happy with all this stuff, all their money getting taken out of their country, etc. Even their top people getting put in power by outsiders. So this is during that whole phase. Now, the Cold War was still going on as well, and so they didn't want a ruckus. Even when a policewoman, they broadcast that she was out directing traffic outside the embassy while the Iranian staff were told to leave, and for some reason, one of the Iranians opened fire with an automatic pistol, machine pistol, and shot this policewoman. Now there's a lot of that's terrible, what a shame, and then the media. But there was no call for, say, martial law techniques, or everybody must be monitored now, or the domestic population of Britain must give up all the rights, because the Cold War was still going on. Russia would have used that. Now they don't have that anymore, and it's out in the open where they always wanted to go. So if they don't actually create the incidents, to create more and more martial law technique and total surveillance, etc., then they certainly aid the groups that they know want to do these things. They certainly aid them financially and with weapons and all the rest of it. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and again, we're getting it constantly. Well, I don't watch TV, but on TV and in the media, it's constantly front page news. Any time there's any slight incident involving in inverted commas terrorism, there's always a Cobra meeting, or somebody's having a special meeting to discuss how they can prevent it in the future. And it's as you say, 20 years ago, or whenever that the Iranian embassy siege was, well, longer than that, wasn't maybe 30 years, I don't know. There was none of this. There was no calls for shutting down London, or patting everybody down at the train stations, or whatever. But these Oyster card things that people have got in London that track you everywhere you go, on the bus and the train, you have to go through barriers with them. I don't think we're too far away in London from certainly seeing barriers at the end of the street where you've got to go through with these things.
Yes.
And that's obviously what they're for. I mean, they're a form of ID card, basically.
Yeah.
Tracking and tracing you everywhere you go.
Well, the oldest idea was always to, if you want to say we're going to keep you safe, but you can have no rights. You can't have one without the other. It's as simple as that. That's what they tell you. And back in the 90s, the late 90s, in Canada, for instance, I knew something was coming up. The big plans, I knew about the American Century Project, and their own website, it was up there. They published it twice with their whole agenda. I think 93, then 97, they republished it. And I thought, well, how are they going to get the world from the supposed flaccid era of peace to all of this and take these countries over with a blowback? And of course, in 98, I think it was, 1998, the Attorney General for Canada, a guy who was always appointed into jobs, Alan Rock, his name was, suddenly put out an omnibus crime bill, which when analysed, and the reporter said this too, this is a completely anti-terrorist and martial law type bill. And in 98, nothing seemed to be happening to the general public. We were lulled to sleep and all the rest of it and kept entertained. And then, as soon as that was signed and put through, he went off to work at the United Nations, right off the bat, immediately. But it was never explained to anybody, including the journalists, why this kind of martial law thing was coming out, and indefinite detention, etc. Well, see, the plans were already made. All the intelligence services knew, here's the agenda, the New American Century Project. Here's the wars we're going to have in 2 or 3 years. Here's the blowback you get. Blowback is when you create radicals, because if folks start bombing your country and you see your families constantly bombed up over 10, 20 years, the youngsters growing up are going to be incredibly radicalized and full of hate. That's natural in all wars, especially extended wars. And so blowback is when that will create the enemy that you didn't have in the first place. I mean, really, if none of this had happened and you didn't have the New American Century Project and you didn't have this constant power grabs of oil and wealth from, say, Africa, diamonds, gold, and all the rest of it, and all the minerals, and yada, 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 and the oil across the Middle East, if you didn't have all that problem going on with private wars going on, commercial wars, you wouldn't have had this physical war. That's basically it. So it was all planned. They knew the blowback they'd get. They knew they'd come down to martial law after 2001. It was all set to go in the books already. And then even all the plans, and the think tanks had 10 years to work on the plans before 9/11. 10 years to think on ways, okay, when this happens, how can we gradually get the folk to accept being monitored, everything they do, where they go, and so on, step by step by step. And they talked about different events they would need to introduce each part of it to the public to get them to accept it. If you do it too suddenly, all at once, this blowback from your own people, your internal people. But if you do it step by step by step and bring all the experts in and really hype it up, then the public will adapt to each step until they get X-rayed at airports and everything else. And it worked pretty smoothly in actual fact, right up to the present time. And now, as I say, an incident that why should the Soviets called this technique collective punishment. If they wanted their own people to be, say, if they had wanted them disarmed, internally in Russia, and so they would get someone who went crazy with a rifle, and then they'd ban it for the whole population. That was called collective punishment. And it's a technique that the West has been using since before, but definitely after 9/11. and really hype up the story until it seems to be everywhere. They do constant, ongoing psychological evaluations of the populations. Back in the 90s, I think it was called the Year of the Gun was the big topic, because there was gangs, Jamaican gangs, Trinidadian gangs, and so on, all fighting each other in Toronto for drug territory, and we're all shooting each other. It was how a day went by in the paper, you didn't hear about something, until the public got used to it again. But after that year, they did surveys on all the populations of Toronto, and after one incident where a white girl was shot, it was great publicity for them. She was shot by a Jamaican who was an illegal immigrant who had been caught 3 or 4 times and revolving door justice and put back on the streets. Like, they wanted this guy to do something eventually, and did. So he shot this white girl who was out. She was engaged, she would get married that next week or something. Beautiful story for the papers, the media, and to get outrage going amongst the people. And then the anti-gun campaign clicked on the act, trying to say, well, we've got to ban all guns from all people, including all hunting guns, and so on and so on and so on. That was used. One person was killed, therefore let's ban all hunters, etc., and register all hunting rifles, etc. So that's how they work on this thing. But they did a survey in the population, and because they hyped that same story for months, they found that the average person in Toronto, just from that one repetitive newscast and theme, were terrified to go out at night, even though the chances of anything happening to them were the same as it always been, 1 in millions, you know. They looked at the psychological impact of creating fear and trepidation of just walking outside your door had massively increased. And that's what they can do with the media, the way it's psychologically presented to the public and introduced to the public, and in the repetition to the public. You can actually get them to adapt to any fallacy that you want.
Yeah, I mean, you've discussed it on your own broadcast before and called it learned helplessness. And that's basically where people are so afraid of doing anything that they feel helpless about anything, even managing their own affairs at home or anything.
Their own personal lives. It creates apathy.
Yeah, well, I mean, apathy. I mean, we're well aware of how apathetic people have become, and whether it's a combination of what you're just talking about there, and the fluoride and all the rest of it, people have certainly, I'd say, given up hope. And I can't imagine being a young person these days and looking at the world and thinking I've got a great future ahead of me.
I know.
And you drive along the road and you see all the school children coming out of school, and you look at them, you wonder what kind of future they're going to have. But then again, they've been kind of stampeded down the road in technology, and they've become almost addicted to it. Or I would say they are addicted to it. And I spoke about this to Aaron Franz and somebody else the other day there about it, and this is the big comfort now. This is all they've got to look forward to is basically playing games for the rest of their lives, because there's going to be nothing for them to do.
Yeah.
That's of any consequence anyway. I don't see any jobs for them or any kind of long-term career they can go into, which hasn't been kind of, I don't know how to describe it, infiltrated by this system, if you like. I mean, not even doctors are having to go to surgeries anymore. You can phone them up on Skype apparently and get a diagnosis. Everything's been taken down to the basis level.
They did studies on the future back in the days of H.G. Wells and his heyday, when the big Fabian Socialist Society, that was just a branch to run the left wing, a branch of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, CFR. They did lots of studies on the population about the creation of apathy, what we're talking about here. And what would happen if eventually you got to a generation where they'd say, well, there's too many of you, we don't need you anymore in a post-industrial society. This was all discussed way before World War I and II, you know. And in ongoing discussions right to the present, if they got a population to accept apathy and being ruled by experts, that was the whole push for the Fabian Socialists, ruled by experts and social workers and advisors and experts of all kinds, your whole life, and monitored your whole life too. Make it so unpleasant and give life less value. So you must devalue life itself, which they've done an awfully good job at. And then you bring in voluntary euthanasia for the desperately ill and terminal. And then you simply up it like Holland there into, well, if you're depressed, why not kill yourself, blah, blah. And now they're even allowing teenagers to make that choice now. So this was all discussed. We were just living through a script right now. That's what we're living through, a script. And every facet of society has been catered to in the script, ongoing studies and updates on how to manipulate each group and gender and everything else, and age group. And they're pretty well getting to that point there. If they make life so, look at all the sci-fis they put out there about end-time catastrophes and everybody living in rubble except the small elite. At the end of those movies, you say, oh, blah, everyone's so blah. And that's an idea of where they'd like to bring your mental state into the state of every day is the same, and it's apathy.
Yeah. In terms of the techniques they use, do the exact same techniques work in every culture, or do they have to kind of doctor it a little to push certain, I'll call them races or cultures in a certain way, because the culture doesn't allow them to be kind of so easily talked into doing certain things?
Yeah. What they did actually in earlier writings, in fact, it's interesting to see the earlier writings, because around 1900, the big organizations that formed, say, the Alfred Milner Group, and who his group joined with the Cecil Rhodes Group, which was Rothschild's group too, and they merged together into the Royal Institute for International Affairs. But they did studies on that kind of future, and what they'd found already Britain, remember, was into India and Africa and all across the globe, dealing with other cultures to dominate them under the pretense again of bringing civilization to them in order, and as they looted the countries. But what they found was, if they could, the easiest thing to do, they said, was to look at the gender. What works with a woman in one country will work with a woman in any country. So don't just look at them as a group of people. Start looking at, gender and age groups, etc. But they also said the same thing that Marx said before that, and Lenin said afterwards, and even Mao Zedong said for China. What they said was the only thing that could defeat this technique of gradualistic change, planned change for domination, was a religion. We forget that religion was an embodiment of the whole culture of the people. If you look at the Muslim people, the religion is their culture. You can't separate the two. It's their way of life. It keeps their order and everything else going amongst them and so on. And you can't separate it. In the West, they've already destroyed most of the religion. And already, the new religion is the state, as you know, because this is just what they said. When religion in the West dies off gradually, the state will already be accepted as the new, and science and the experts accepted as the new bosses, basically. That's harder to do in, say, Muslim countries, because their culture is the religion. This idea of democracy is an alien concept to them. So they have to alter. What they're trying to do across the world is go for the very young. That's what the United Nations and UNESCO is all about. Get to the very young across the world. Try and westernize them through things that the young are really hyper about, like sex. When their hormones are kicking in, they're young, that's all they're thinking about. So start showing them stuff they've never seen in their own country. Make sure they all have cell phones, etc. Make sure they can all watch music, television, or movies, and give them lots and lots of sex. And they'll turn against their parents, so they'll be different from their parents. That's what they hope for. And to an extent it will work with some, but not perhaps all, in a culture which is very bonded together with a religion, which is their culture, as I say. And for them it's worked for thousands of years, fine. So they have to tweak it. The other way is to bribe leaders and try to take it over that way, straightforward bribes, just like how Britain set up Saudi Arabia. Folk who don't know that, Britain set it up, London did, I should say. And Philby was involved in that too, by the way, the double agent. But they set it up, Saudi Arabia, they made sure that those guys at the top, the Saudis, the princes and so on, would be awfully rich, and they would have dynasties. And when dynasties form, unfortunately, they start to lose their identity with the general public, and they become an elite group. And then they're your man, basically, for life, as long as you make sure they're safe as well. They'll play ball with you. So you can't try and bribe you outrightly. If they can't bribe you, they'll try and have a coup, as the CIAs and Troyes were doing, and simply eliminate you and replace you.
Yeah.
So that's the real world.
Yeah. We talk about dynasties. I mean, it's not just in those types of countries that those exist. I mean, in Ireland, particularly in my experience, you've got families there who've been in politics for centuries, and they're still there. The sons take over the seat, and that's it. And the same in Britain. Well, I don't know if it's to a lesser extent, but a less obvious extent maybe in Britain. But I mean, in Ireland, it's in your face that it's just families running the country. Yeah. So, and the parochialism there is incredible. You know, people it doesn't matter what they do to you over there. The people will vote for you. You know, and they I don't know if it's something in the Irish psyche or whatever. They just think, oh well, fair play to him, he got away with it. You know, and that again is a corruption of society in itself, and that it breeds that kind of corruption at lower levels.
It does. You definitely emulate what you see above you, especially if you're young and you catch on quick. You can emulate what you see at the top, and they become your role models. In fact, if you're a recruit, you become one of them. And once remember, every top family starts off, say in ancient times, or even in the Middle Ages, by slaughtering the folk around you to take power. And then you install yourself, and after a generation, you're the good king or the good queen or the best queen or whatever. And it's the same thing with crooks like the Bronfmans, who ran the whiskey trade, you know, illicit whiskey trade all through Canada and the States during Prohibition, and made millions, incredible empire. And give it a generation after that, put in the best universities, and they're respectable. The Kennedys were the same. They were involved with the Bronfmans, in fact, in the whiskey running. And they became respectable. So it's all to do with image making, but the reality is it's all started by gangsterism and brutal force and slaughter.
Yeah, well, I suppose the Rockefellers are another example of that. You know, the great philanthropists of modern times, as they like to see themselves.
Yeah, they blew up competitors' wells. They had gangs going around blowing up what they called well cats, guys who were independent. They blew their wells up and all the rest of it. And his idea, remember, he was part of a worldwide group in his day, Rockefeller. He was put to the States for that reason. And his family was, anyway. Same with the Bronfmans, by the way, a great history of how they came into Canada. They sat doggo for a long time and then were activated, and poof, the day take off. But you find that standardization is the key. The Rockefeller is just getting rid of all the competition in oil. It said we'll get the shareholders all on board with the same one company, and that's what they called it, Standard Oil, to standardize prices, price fixing, everything else. And if you didn't join them, he'd put you under by every means possible, and he did. Great documentaries been put out in the past about him. And even today, David Rockefeller has talked on the history of his family. He justifies it all, saying, well, if this guy had taken our offer, he'd been okay, you know.
It's almost like the Godfather movie, and the horse's head in the bed, isn't it? I made him an offer he couldn't refuse.
It's exactly like that.
Yeah.
And then you got also you got the fact that it isn't just theirs. Rockefeller got into the standardization of the American culture, and he took over the culture industry across America and helped finance it. He took over he created the American Medical Association, standardized the big pharma. He's still got five big pharma companies worldwide. And they'd run the medical association. They'd run the training for the doctors, what they're going to get taught, what they're going to believe, right down to the same old treatment for cancers, radiation, and poison chemotherapy. They've standardized everything. So they don't come in and say, we want to get rich. No, they came in with a mission to take everything over until they monopolize everything that you need to survive. Food, water, medicine, everything. And work itself, in fact. And government.
Yeah. And of course that the American culture, as you said, it was created, and that's the culture they're now trying to spread everywhere. I think I don't know. Was Japan one of the early experiments of that? Because they seemed to get into all this Elvis Presley stuff, and all the teenagers started quiffing their hair and leather jackets and all that kind of.
Fascinating story with Japan. And as I mentioned before, after World War II, they immediately set up, because they've been planning it, to set up these cultural influencers, they called them, across the old warring factions, like enemies in face, enemies. They completely rebuilt the whole culture for Germany, right down to you couldn't get taught history before 1945. That's a big feat when you think about it. And they call it the denazification of Germany. And any old ideas that led to it had to be completely eliminated from memory. And that you were told a whole different story. In Japan, Harry Hopkins was involved along with FDR. During the war, they planned what they'd do a post-war Japan. And they said they'd set up a banking system run by the U.S., but going through the government to distribute grants to the private companies that used to be part of the war machinery in Japan. And they're still going today. But they would completely obliterate the warrior mentality of the culture itself. They'd use it as a big experimental basin. And they did. Right at the present time, they're still doing it. And they also tried to see if they could utterly destroy the sexual bonding of men and women there. The sexual deviancy in Japan, what we think is deviancy, has been promoted from the top. You can go into restaurants and see it, and you want to see and get anything you want to see. It's just incredible how they've completely destroyed a rigid, strong culture and given it this completely strange culture that's constantly malleable according to direction of those who control it.
Yeah, there's a great documentary on Japan called Love and Hate in Japan. I don't know if you've seen that one. It's on YouTube. It's a guy there, and he's living with this younger girl, and she's having to be an escort agency. They've got like 2 or 3 jobs each, just to try and survive in this shoebox. And he was quite an activist back in the 80s, I think it was, and he had like 10,000 people in the street, and they really clamped down with the kind of martial law thing there against him. And that's well worth a watch, and it shows you where they're trying to take us. Literally, these people were living in what can only be described as a cupboard, and it was awful, and just
what was the title of that one?
Love and Hate in Japan. And yeah, I mean, it's very kind of frank, and it kind of ends in a happy ending. But yeah, I mean, if anybody wants to see where they're taking us with this Agenda 21 rubbish, here it is, And of course, Japan was the first place to come out with these. Well, I believe it was the first place to come out with these kind of horizontal cubicles you just crawled into and slept in overnight underground.
That's right.
Yeah,
like beehives, and also getting back to the sexual thing too. They introduced there first of all the whole concept of transferring your sexual attention to very lifelike dolls. It's a booming trade in Japan. Until and they've done documentaries on that too, and these are very wealthy folk often that have a room full of these life-size, very woman-looking dolls, not just blow-up rubber things, real professionally made, and to see if they can transfer their affection onto something which is actually inanimate and really non-human, and you project a humanness onto them, a humanity onto them, but. Just to see, because what they can use in one country, if it works, they find out the technique that led to it working, and then they can use it anywhere in the world. It goes for all their goals, basically.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Japan is the kind of seen as the home of robotics, so I guess that's a logical step forward for them, isn't it? To go down this way. But again, that's how. I mean, how do you persuade somebody to have affection for a machine? I suppose people like their cars. They don't want to get rid of that particular car because they love it, or whatever it may be, their favorite piece of jewellery or whatever. But inanimate objects, I guess at these stages these things won't be inanimate, will they? But I mean, how do you train the human mind to do that?
It's quite simple. If you read Charles Galton Darwin, who was a physicist in the 1950s in Britain, he put out the book. It was called The Next Million Years, talking about the need for the elite to so distance themselves from the masses who would gradually die off and be controlled and so on. They'd have to do this. It was a duty to do this. And he said that the first thing is to break the attraction between men and women. That will depopulate naturally right away. And then, too, if there's no family structure, man, woman, children, you won't stand up and fight for them when they're being oppressed. So you'll be stuck individually with Big Brother talking down to you, just like the screen in Orwell's 84. And government would be more effective. Wells said the same thing, but Charles Galton Darwin says, he said that gradually through techniques, which they knew, because they worked with Bernays, by the way, and he knew Bernays because Charles Galton Darwin lived in Manhattan for a while. He worked on the Manhattan Project, one of the scientists there. And he had lots of debates with these guys and big do's, big think tanks, how to bring the people to accept materialism and rather have materialistic things like a car instead of having a wife, and then how to get wives to want cars and not have, or women to want cars and not have men. Then too, how they could gradually introduce through the creation of movements appearing to be social movements, that there's a lot of deviancy among society, which was called deviancy then, homosexuality, lesbianism, and so on, and then gradually make that a normal part of society until there was no normality left for them at all. And if you get into the school system, get them trained early into this kind of thing, none of them would mate up in a natural way, and they wouldn't have offspring. That was the main goal of it, not to have offspring. It also masculinize the women so that they wouldn't be attractive to the men. They'd be more aggressive. But he also said, it's so interesting, he said, by the use of hormones, he says we can alter the mentality of the male, we can become more effeminate. And he says you can also make the women more aggressive. So almost a role reversal. And so he's talking about bioengineering the people. And this is in the 50s. And guarantee if that was being said in the 50s, the top think tanks, they were already trying it out in different areas. And he said the same thing, we're putting the food in the water, etc.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the ultimate result of all this psychological stampeding, if you want to use that term, is that your 2.4 children family, your average family or whatever, they're all going in different directions. The woman's now become the man's become the woman, and the children don't know who they are or where they're going.
The children are brought up by the state. That's what the state says. They give them the new values. It's pushed to school. It's all social indoctrination. When your schools are sexually indoctrinating them into different techniques and so on of thinking or behaving, went into that kind of thing. This has nothing to do with education as it used to be. This is complete social engineering. Yeah.
So as I say, like your mum and dad and the children are all different points of the compass, all going different directions, and there's no cohesion whatsoever, and that's the ultimate goal.
And it's worked awfully well, isn't it?
Oh yeah, we see the results of it everywhere. Family breakdown and societal breakdown, of course. Okay, Alan, that's our hour done. Thanks for coming on again, and I'll be on Monday again with Thomas Sheridan talking about the music industry. I know there's a lot of people looking forward to that one, so I'll look forward to that one myself. And I'll talk to you later. Take care.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye now.